All right, welcome to another episode of Open World Chat. I'm your host, John Odom. I'm here with my co-host, Mark Card. Today, we're going to veer a little into a realm we don't talk enough about, just a little bit, which is horror. But, as we're a podcast that works on everything from a sort of unapologetically progressive bent, we're going to drop something else in there. We're going to talk about immigration and horror. We're going to talk about certain amount of cosmic horror. We're going to be mentioning dropping names like H.P. Lovecraft. You're going to learn a lot. I'm going to learn a lot. Mark's probably not going to learn a lot because Mark knows all this shit already. But
No,
anyway,
no, 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 no. It's the thing where as you get older, you find out just how little you actually know.
well, you were wanting to dive right into some stuff with H.P. Lovecraft. And I don't know, does H.P. Lovecraft even need an introduction? Probably not on this show. We'd certainly spoken about his racist proclivities in the past on this show back a couple years ago. But yeah, but how does immigration fit into this? Dare I ask? Because I can just imagine.
Well, it's interesting. I did a little timeline search, and right about the time you get the first mention of the city Carcosa, it's a short story by, hard to believe, but Ambrose Bierce. That's about 1886.
Ooh.
Shortly after that, you get some pretty big pieces of legislation which start to restrict immigration. And I don't think it's a coincidence. And they're, doing some research on the net. There's a whole lot of other people who don't think this is a coincidence.
Hmm.
They focus mostly on Lovecraft, and that's with good reason. So, what I want to do is I want to start out by reading a couple of different quotes
Oh yeah, we love quotes.
by Lovecraft, and I just have to bring them up here. Two quotes. One is from his fiction, and another is in a different context. So this one's a little bit long. It says, "The organic things inhabiting that awful cesspool could not by any stretch of the imagination be called human. They were monstrous and nebulous adumbrations of the pithecanthropoid and amoebal, vaguely molten from some stinking, vicious slime of Earth's corruption, and slithering and oozing in and on the filthy streets, or in and out of windows or doorways in a fashion suggestive of nothing but infesting worms or deep sea unnameabilities. They, or the degenerate gelatinous fermentation of which they were composed, seemed to ooze, seep, and trickle through the gaping cracks in the horror houses. And I thought of some avenue of cyclopean and unwholesome vats, crammed to the vomiting point with gangrenous vileness, and about to burst and inundate the world in one leprous cataclysm of semi-fluid rottenness." So I didn't really uh, put in there what piece of his work that's from, because I just took a picture of the quote. But that's from one of his pieces of fiction. Now here's a description of
That's the adjective award, that's for sure.
yeah. Yeah, he's a little bit Dickensian in his prose.
Yeah.
So this is actually from a little piece of uh correspondence, and it says, this is from Lovecraft speaking now. "I'm more interested in keeping the present 300-year-old culture germ in America unharmed than in trying out any experiments in, quote, social justice, end quote. Some people may like the idea of a mongrel America like the late Roman Empire, but I, for one, prefer to die in the same America that I was born in. Therefore, I'm against any candidate who talks of letting down the bars to stunted, brachycephalic South Italians and rat-faced half-Mongoloid Russian and Polish Jews. All that cursed scum. You in the Middle West can't conceive of the extent of the menace. You ought to see a typical Eastern city crowd, swart, aberrant physiognomies and gestures and jabbering born of alien instincts."
Wow.
So
Well, I knew it was bad. I always forget just how bad he was.
yeah, he was a terrible human being. And I was reading one piece that said, we can't just uh, boil this down to, well, everybody in America was racist. He was
Right.
partic he was particularly vile.
Right, right. I hate that argument anyways, the oh well they were a man of the times. That only gets you so far and it's used just thrown around constantly. But you can't make that argument with him. He wasn't just
No,
a man of the times. He was a racist by those standards.
yeah, he was terrible. His wife, who interestingly was a Russian Jewish immigrant, um, who he considered, quote, fully assimilated, end quote, because, it was his own biological urge involved. Uh, she said that it would make him so mad to walk through a place where you had these immigrants that he would want to punch every single one of them in the face.
Mhm.
So, but the reason why I chose these two quotes is it's obvious he's talking about the exact same two kinds of beings in two different contexts. This element of being the other, and that's what you're afraid of, he's just made it a metaphor, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a parallel that's been drawn before. And
Yes.
it's interesting because I'm gonna see your H.P. Lovecraft and I'm gonna raise you H.G. Wells here.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
H.G. Wells, um, and you see it in his work in a different way. But he was also he was big on the dangers of immigration. And in his case, he well, first of all, he was worried about any and all immigration in the U.S. He obviously wasn't from the U.S., but he wrote about the U.S.
Right.
and he liked the U.S. And he felt like immigration was going to simply overcome what was already the native, the American culture, not the native culture, but
Right.
and that either immigration was going to have to be slowed down so that these folks could, integrate into society, or the U.S. is going to be stuck basically with having to have, he didn't quite say it in this way, but he implied massive social programs to take care of all the chaos that they were going to bring in. Now, he didn't specifically, lean on, like, say, the Chinese or the Mexicans. He also talked about the Irish, of course, because it was fun to beat up on the Irish. He beat up on French Canadians, even. He was just
I'm sorry, I can't think of a more benign group of immigrants than French Canadians.
no, right? But the thing is, though, the difference is he would say that these are hardworking people. You know,
Yeah.
he didn't. I mean, there was some implicit racism that he would not have recognized as racism, and a lot of people wouldn't have.
Well, and
These
the
are
other thing
really
is,
hardworking people, but they're going to water things down, and there's just too many coming in.
right, in almost all circles in literary criticism, Wells is considered incredibly progressive for the time.
I know, right? Progressive for the time is so interesting.
I
And
mean,
he was. He generally was. This was,
mm,
but people get all funky about issues when you start talking about immigration and race. Did people get weird?
right. It's very strange.
Mhm.
It's interesting because we talk about let's introduce another author in here. So Robert Howard,
Mhm.
the author of Conan the Barbarian,
Mhm.
a fellow Texan. He and Lovecraft had a long correspondence beginning in about 1930. That takes place about, what, 13 years after. Okay, so essentially what happens is this, is that mass immigration is completely open, almost completely open in the United States until about 1917. In 1917, they pass an act which implements a literacy test of basic comprehension in any language for anybody over 16. Now, they had already established the what was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. So nobody from Asia outside Filipinos and Japanese were allowed in. They had a quota system enacted in 21, which was set at 3% of the total population of the foreign born of each nationality in the United States. as recorded in the 2000, sorry, the 1910 census.
Mhm.
And the total number of visas was set at 350,000 per year. So this is a Lovecraft is already in his prime period, and Howard is doing fairly well publishing as well. So they're already pretty well established authors, but it's crazy to read some of this correspondence. Um, like Wells, Howard is a little bit more tolerant of immigration.
Mhm.
He's in Texas, and he talks about the big cotton farms in South Texas. And
Mhm.
he says the death rate is enormous. The birth rate is even more enormous. They live like rats and breed like flies.
Mhm.
Later, he goes on to say that he's okay with the Mexicans who are already here, but he preferred Mexicans to the Italians. And then he didn't really like Germans, but he thought the German immigrants in Texas were at least respectable. He said they're thrifty, law-abiding, and hardworking, superior in living standards to the Mexicans, the Sicilians who swarm our coasts.
You know,
So and he really hated New Orleans.
oh, oh, you know,
Well, you had the Italian Black Hand there. It was he did not like New Orleans because of the foreign populations, and so they carried on a long, long correspondence about this. They talk about American founding stock, i.e., Anglo-Saxons,
right, sure.
and so when you look at Lovecraft, he is about as American as you can get, being from Rhode Island.
Sure.
And they're both from American founding stock, which basically means white Northern European, and in their case, it essentially means anybody from the British Isles. That's fine, and that's what they want to kind of keep going. They want to, as they would say these days, they don't want any threat to the culture.
Mhm.
And the scary part of this is totally active in a large number of people in one of the American political parties right now. It
Mhm.
is crazy how this kind of thing has just, I don't know, bloomed as though it were some kind of fungus that was waiting for the exact right conditions, something that had been dormant for a long time. So they're perfectly okay with anybody from the British Isles coming in, and
Oh, of course, yeah, yeah, and we're sort of talking about the writers, but I mean, this stuff is popping up in their work, which
it's
is
everywhere in their work. Yeah, I
everywhere in their
mean,
work. And I shouldn't mention Wells on a horror uh uh show, but our horror podcast where we're talking, although I think there are clearly elements of horror in his work, but you think of the Time Machine with the Morlocks supporting the Eloi in their seemingly perfect lives, but they're actually eating them,
yeah,
and that's exactly what he was concerned about creating, was an underclass of immigrants that would cause civilization to consume itself in a sense. So I
yeah,
think that's there, and but again, I don't want to spin off into sci-fi here. But yeah, no, Lovecraft, his stuff was replete with this kind of attitude.
yeah, and look at this is more fantasy, of course, but look at the villains, the bad guys in Howard's work, in all the Conan. They're all Asiatic. They're all the great horde that Conan has to stop. And so this element is here everywhere. And I think it shows up in modern society.
Hmm.
And I think often in horror, there's this blurring of the line between horror and uh science fiction. Is It comes up in Aliens, all kinds of movies that deal with extraterrestrials.
Oh, absolutely. I have made, because I'm a total nerd about this stuff. I've made a classification for movie aliens. All right. And there's one particular we're talking about now. All right, there's the rescuer, there's Superman and refugees such as E.T. who somehow help us become our true selves.
Right.
There's the judge like Klaatu or the Metrons in Star Trek. There's the
Sure.
Ball, the Third Rock, the Coneheads, Resident Alien. And then
Oh,
there's
another good one of that is Paul.
Paul, right. I forgot about Paul. But then there's the Invader, and that's really what you talk about. And
Yep.
I'm saying sci-fi again. In this case, when you get to the Invader, you really start getting into sci-fi horror. Uh,
Well, my
that's where
favorite.
you get the alien from, and you get that sort of para horror stuff like Quatermass in the Pit. More recently, the Invaders are, well, was going to say folks like the Klingons of the Goa'uld, but they're of course not horror either. But there's plenty of horror. This is where our fears come out.
Yeah, it's the thing.
Hmm.
The
So,
thing. That's the best example of this kind of Lovecraftian horror and fear of things not like us.
oh, that thing. You mean the thing from another world?
Yes, the
Yes.
thing.
Or the
And
blob,
that's go ahead.
the blob too.
No, the Blob is a great example of
Mhm.
that. It's interesting. Who did I see recently? They did a classification S tier to F tier of, oh, I know who it was. It was now his name escapes me. The guy who oh, he's famous. The guy who ruins all the science fiction movies.
No,
DeGrasse
doesn't
Tyson.
ruin them. He likes them.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But he said, in terms of aliens, the most scientific alien invader is the Blob. And he said that because, of course, it's a life form, but it's completely different than human life forms.
Hmm.
So I just thought that was interesting that he we mentioned the Blob, and he's one of these alien invaders, and DeGrasse Tyson says, "Hey, he's a scientifically accurate alien, or better science
Or
anyway."
could be. Worked for him anyway. Uh, More like a gelatinous cube or something.
Yeah, well, that's def gelatinous aliens are definitely something that's involved. But it goes back to the fear of the unknown. We
Mhm.
have this established culture, and what's going to happen to it? All these people have different customs and languages and cultures, and oh my God, we can't let them have that. And so it's just this comes down to just territoriality.
Yeah. Yeah. Then there's when again you're talking sci-fi horror, and I'm still living in the past here, but so much of the old stuff was so sort of primal, and so much of what we've made since builds off of it. But there's that insidious other that I think you can also tie to a different type of horror informed by immigration concerns at the time. Um, Especially when you start talking about foreigners bringing in communism.
Oh yeah.
And you get a whole slew of movies that are afraid of immigrants bringing in communism. At least that's how I interpret them. I mean, and we go back and forth to some of them sometimes, like Body Snatchers.
Yes. One of my favorites is Earth versus the Flying Saucers.
Earth versus the Flying Saucers. Yeah, that's a good invader movie. Not quite so insidious, but I love that Ray Harryhausen stuff. Gotta love it.
Well, I just think about the imagery in the movie. You've got the UFO crashing into the White House, or the UFO crashing into the Washington Monument,
Hmm.
and just the implication is that the aliens are going to destroy all the principles inherent in American constitutional democracy.
Right. I mean, that one's overt. It's not subtle, but that's exactly
Yeah.
right. They're crashing into it. And when I talk about this stuff, I'm I'm talking about, and I think, you are too, where this stuff creeps out. When they made, say, Village of the Damned, it it didn't occur to anybody that what I'm making is something about insidious foreign influence coming in and corrupting our children, and then bringing down our idyllic small towns and things. But
You know,
that's
I,
what they wrote, and that comes from something.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is I've just thought of another example of that, which is pretty subtle, and that's Wicker Man.
Wicker Man, they're not coming here in Wicker Man, but
Oh,
we go.
they're already here. I get that.
Mm,
But it's still this, well, maybe that's not a good example. I was just thinking that I was thinking about the insidious part of it. Uh oh no, that's that seems to me definitely part of it. That's the native population working behind the scenes to control anybody who might be an outsider.
mhm.
I mean, that's the whole point is he comes to this village investigating this death, and then he finds out that it's basically a cult which is trying to maintain the culture of the pagan, Celts, the
Mm.
original native species. So it's a little bit what we're talking about, but in reverse. Instead of the insidiousness coming from the alien horde, it's the reaction of the native population to the alien horde, which we would just consider everyday people. So maybe it's the obverse or the inverse of what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I want to make a distinction too, because when you talk about insidious horror, or that sort of
Yeah.
thing, you end up going towards demonic horror really quickly. And I do think demonic horror is different. I feel like trying to sort of shoehorn in a lot of immigration fears into that might be pushing it a bit much
Yeah.
as we might like to. But I
Because
want to leave demonic horror aside.
I think it's interesting you mentioned Quartermass and the Pit.
Yeah, I just love that.
That's
That's
one of my
probably not
favorite.
a good fit, but it's one of my favorite movies. I
It's one
have
of my favorite movies from that period of time. We might have to do a separate episode just on that movie.
on the whole Quatermass. We could do a Quatermass episode. That'd be cool. I think the last time we recorded one of these episodes, you couldn't see it, but I was wearing my Quatermass and the Pit t-shirt.
It's interesting that movie in this country had a different title.
Oh, it was how many million years to Earth?
40 million years to
40
Earth.
million years to Earth. I couldn't remember. I was thinking it was three, but maybe that's million miles to Earth with the Emir, but that's a whole different story. Um, it's so many movies, so many ways to get there, so many years, so many miles. Yeah, no, I love that movie, and that is definitely horror sci-fi. Isn't it funny how so often you hear, well, not so often, but every time people want to attribute the birth of sci-fi horror to Alien, it makes me crazy.
Yeah,
I mean, the birth of sci-fi horror was Frankenstein.
sure, of course. Yeah, I mean generally in literary circles, Frankenstein is considered the birth of science fiction.
Yeah, I know. I don't know that I agree with that, but
That's a different episode.
that's a different episode, right? I think it was a Persian writer, but anyways, different episode. I'll edit that part out. Nowadays it's really interesting. We've talked about fears of immigration informing horror because it terrifies people, and people are terrified of what it's going to do to our society, what it's going to do to our children, what it's going to do to our communities. But you actually see immigrants popping up in horror now, and it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, not that often, of course, but His House
Yeah,
was a terrific horror movie, and that's where the immigrants are. It's a sort of a perfect setting for horror when you talk about immigration from countries where there's a lot of tough stuff going on.
yeah.
Not the English guys going to America, but in this case, folks from the Sudan, if I remember it correctly.
Yeah,
Um, and it's a perfect setting because these are folks who are in an alien culture. They're feeling very powerless
right.
at the whims of, not just the institutions, but their individual neighbors. That's a perfect setting for horror. And
Yeah,
I mean, it's
and they
funky.
have no protection from anybody,
Right, right.
and so they have to rely on themselves,
Hmm.
and that just alienates them even more from the culture that they're trying to be part of.
You had a little flurry of these movies, and it's interesting. And I wonder if we're going to get more. There's No One Gets Out Alive,
Hmm.
Beneath Us, which I didn't see. I think it was supposed to suck. But anyways, yeah, so that's new. And that's bringing it all out into the open. And when you bring it out into the open, in a way, you have to confront that racism. You have to, if you're going to actually make horror about immigrants, you've got to confront the fact that there has been horror about immigrants for decades.
For a long time,
It's
yeah.
been very racist. It's been very ugly. Uh, but it's a new world right now.
Yeah, it is. I'm surprised Jordan Peele hasn't tackled this one yet.
That's true. That would be a great sort of topic for him. And if he could give it that element of satire, which is so, I mean, Get Out was just, again, I don't want to digress too much, but that movie was so damn good.
Well, I mean, and honestly, who would have thought that this guy from a sketch comedy duo would be such a great film director?
I know, right? It's right. There's a
I
lot of,
mean, it's clear he spent a lot of time watching horror and sci-fi movies and a lot of time thinking about, what the social implications of them are. This kind of brings me around to one of my favorite examples of racism and white supremacy and Lovecraft. Did you see the HBO series Lovecraft Country?
oh, Lovecraft Country was just great how it, deconstructed that stuff, turned it on its head. That was an extraordinary series. I miss
And the
it.
books and the book's even better.
Oh, that's right. It was based on a book.
It was based on a book. And so I just think it was great how they flipped it and showed the African American characters turning the power of this uh, cosmological um, horror back on the people who had uh, um, used it and harnessed it to create this white supremacist society. And so I just think that it's not immigration in the way we think of immigration now, but of course it goes back to slavery.
Oh, sure.
And that's another element to the uh immigration and horror connection.
Hmm.
A lot of this stuff happens right after the Civil War.
Yeah.
In the 20 to 30 year period after the Civil War, that's when Beers wrote Carcosa. I mean, it mentioned Carcosa. That's
Yeah.
when Chambers wrote The King in Yellow.
Don't know it.
It's interesting to me, The King in Yellow, the first kind of epithet they give him is he's a protector of shepherds. So
Okay.
it's kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, it's
Why is that
interesting to
an
me.
epithet? Wait a minute.
No, no, yeah, that's not an epithet. I can't think of the actual epithet.
Oh, okay.
Um, but they talk about how uh, I just think it's interesting that it's that post Civil War period when you first start to see the kind of arc of this kind of horror show up.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, that you're dealing with a whole lot of different social change besides immigration, but immigration is definitely part of it. And when we talk about immigration, I guess this would be migration. Remember that there was a giant mass migration of former slaves to the north.
Right. Right, right. And to them, you had a similar dynamic there. That's true. And so that you're saying that that was informing that particular fiction.
I really do think that kind of thing was informing it. You have this mass immigration of Italians and Slavic Jews and people who are other than kind of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that at the same time, you've got this mass migration of African Americans up to the northern cities where there was more industry and more jobs and a whole lot less oppression. Well,
Mhm.
nominally anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, a lot of folks were gonna be okay with the other coming in if they stopped being the other, you know,
yeah,
if they integrated. Or turned in through were processed into the melting pot. which is, an idea now, which is kind of anathema to any idea of diversity, cultural diversity at all.
Yeah, now they're thinking about so one of the metaphors they used in the late 60s was a salad bowl.
So that's pretty good. Well,
Well, that
who's the ultimate immigrant? Who's the immigrant that everyone likes, that everyone loves, that the archetype of what's the immigrant America really wants?
Kal-El, son of Jor-El.
There, I knew you'd get that. That one's an easy one, right?
It's
Comes
obviously
in,
Superman. It's
slides in
obviously
easily
Superman.
right into the Midwest, protects us, helps us, keeps our society running.
Unless you're talking about Red Sun.
Right. Well, that he comes around, right?
That's one of my favorite Superman variations, though.
Oh yeah, it's a good one. It's classic for sure. I finally got around to reading it only recently, and it's good stuff. Yeah. Well, I think we've been talking about this a while, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
Probably wrap it up. Otherwise, otherwise we'll be here all week.
That's a running theme.
It's too easy to talk, by God. Thank you all for joining us
Yes, thank
for
you.
Open World Chat. We'll be back next week. What are we talking about next week? Oh, not next week. I'm sorry, 2 weeks from now. We'll be back 2 weeks from now. There's something else to edit. Oh, no, I don't know what we're talking about 2 weeks from now. Never mind. I'm cutting all that out. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Thanks for
Yep.
listening.
Yes, thank you.
Our theme music is by Christopher Piatek.